Hello, 7th grade. Welcome to the third and final video about the Cold War. Now, in class, you had talked about duck and cover, the arms race, right? The arms race meaning the Soviet Union and the United States trying to build as many weapons, bombs, missiles, etc. as possible to outspend the other nation to show which country was the most powerful. That's the argument here. That's the arms race. And also sending someone to the moon faster than anyone else. The arms race also, it really included, all right, the space race, how quickly and how fast and who can get what country can get someone into space and to the moon fastest. That would show a pretty superior military. So even then, again, we looked at the movies part. The Cold War moves to Asia. We didn't spend a lot of time on China because we spent a whole unit on it. But obviously containment is failing because communism has moved into China. And China has based its government off of what it looks like in the Soviet Union. We then have a war in Korea, where Northern Korea is backed by the Soviets and communism, and Southern Korea is backed by the United States and the United Nations for democracy. And so the Korean War, America's forgotten war, eventually led to many Americans wondering why we were fighting and 54,000 Americans dying. And the war ended in a stalemate where there's a border between North and South Korea at the 38th parallel. So the Korean War for containment, another failure. And so it showed that the United States, even though they were the biggest military and they spent all these billions of dollars on the military, that doesn't really mean that the United States is winning the Cold War. So the United States' stalemate in Korea showed that the fight against communism really isn't going well. We then looked at the Cold War reaching Cuba. Cuba has a revolution and falls to communism, where Fidel Castro, this guy right here, comes to power. And Cuba's only 90 miles away from the United States, and Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, immediately forms a good relationship with the Soviet Union. So now the Cold War is moving its way into the Western Hemisphere. Now, people in the United States were worried that communism would go from Cuba to the United States. So in April of 1961, the United States tried to overthrow Castro's government at what was called the Bay of Pigs. The job was to make their way into Cuba, attack through the bay, and then make their way to Fidel Castro and kill him. It was a disaster. So again, the United States can't defeat communism. It's crazy. So even America invading a neighboring island, they're not successful. And the reason why they wanted to do this was they also noticed, wow, later on after the Bay of Pigs, we see this missile equipment that's made its way onto Cuba's island. Well, I don't know if they have that capability to do so. They got it from the Soviets. The Soviets were building a missile launching site in Cuba. And when the president announced these discovery of all of this in 1962, the government and the people started to freak out. Maybe nuclear warfare would head and happen to the United States. And so Cuba had almost had the ability at the time to send nuclear weapons to New York, Washington, Chicago, Denver, even Atlanta, Miami, because this crisis, it was close. I mean, the Soviets had sent nuclear weapons to Cuba. And so for 13 days in 1962, the United States and Russia and Cuba worked through, you know how it is. They had to negotiate what to do. So this is a short little flick on the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's pretty good. Watch it in class. And it shows, wow, the United States and Cuba almost went to war over the threat of sending nuclear weapons to the United States. John F. Kennedy and the Soviet Union eventually worked out a negotiation where now finally the United States' cold relationship with the Soviet Union, they're able to barter, they're able to work together, they're able to bargain. So the missiles would be moved from Cuba. But communism under Fidel Castro would still rule in Cuba. So again, communism has made its way into the Western Hemisphere near the United States. Taking a sip of coffee, hold on. Now, the Cold War isn't done. The Cold War reaches Vietnam. Vietnam is now fighting communism. Northern Vietnam is falling to communism, again closer to China, closer to the Soviet Union. And South Vietnam, funded by capitalism. So when you take a look and you read through this part of the document, you'll see that the Viet Cong, those who are in North Vietnam, are fighting against the free in South Vietnam. And President Lyndon Baines Johnson in the United States thought, we don't need to get involved. We'll be okay. We're not going to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. Well, he went against his word. And this image shows us American soldiers marching into Vietnam. And it was tough because in Vietnam, this Cold War to fight against communism, the North Vietnamese didn't wear military uniforms. The South Vietnamese didn't wear military uniforms. So you really didn't know who the enemy was. And that's what made the Vietnam War hard. And one of the things, too, is the United States didn't know the territory. Home field advantage didn't really apply to the United States. Same in Korea. So the United States was battling out, how do we defeat an enemy we don't even see, and we don't even know what they look like. The United States even drafted American boys to go to Vietnam. And it looked like 35,000 young men a month were being sent to Vietnam against their will. And this leads to a big anti-war movement, or we call the hippie movement. So we're starting to see protests against the containment policies. Why in the United States do we have to care about what's going on in North Korea? In North Vietnam. Sorry, you know the drill. So finally, even music was written about the anti-war movement and who cares about communism in Asian countries. You can listen to some of these. You've heard some of them. Well, it gets pretty bad. The Vietnam War ends, but not before there are protests where American students are killed at Kent State University at a peaceful protest. Well, then some of them started throwing rocks, and 4 students were killed, which showed Vietnam was not popular. And the attempt to prevent communism from spreading to Vietnam, it was not successful. It was not working. Eventually, the Vietnam War would come to an end with more than 58,000 soldiers dying and 300,000 soldiers wounded. And again, people wondered, what in the world is our nation doing out there? Why are we supposed to go fight communism? Vietnam falls to communism not long after the United States pulls out of Vietnam. And really, the United States had not gained anything political or economic or territorial. And the Vietnam War is considered America's least popular war and the second longest war in American history. The war in Afghanistan ended up being the longest war. This is the Vietnam War Memorial, which we're going to see when we go to Washington, D.C. So the United States, they're just seeing that we cannot contain communism. Communism is spreading in Asia, China, North Korea, and now Vietnam. The United States is failing to contain communism. Well, the United States is, again, spending more and more and more money. This is the Berlin Wall, by the way. Is spending more and more money on weapons. Now, the United States they fail horribly in containing communism. All of these countries fall to communism. And the Soviet Union, they're starting to grow really stronger. But when President Ronald Reagan takes office, he really takes it to a whole new level. President Reagan argues that the Soviet Union is an evil empire and that we need to fight against this evil empire, this evil communist empire. Finally, we see, as the Soviets are spending a lot of money, a lot of their resources, and their citizens are becoming poor as the government is becoming too big and spending too much, it seems like, wow, maybe America is winning this Cold War. Maybe Eastern European nations and the Soviet Union are becoming less powerful. Sorry. Maybe the Iron Curtain is beginning to crumble. Well, what the United States starts to do is they start sending more money and more weapons around the world to help free governments fight communist governments. And the United States then refused to negotiate or trade with communist nations. So any communist country, the United States refused to work with or trade with. Finally, well, the Soviet Union started burning through a lot of their money and resources, remember, so goods like his shoes, clothing, food, even soap were in low supply in the Soviet Union because they were only trading within themselves. Eventually, the Soviet Union, they had to ration goods, and new leader Mikhail Gorbachev basically said our policies need to change, and we need to spend less money on making nuclear weapons and more money on, well, helping our people. Ronald Reagan gives a speech in 1987, which we watched this in class, and if you didn't, you need to watch this, where Ronald Reagan says, Mr. Gorbachev, standing in front of the Berlin Wall in Berlin, says, Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, tear down this wall. And he gave this speech where people on the Eastern German side, the communist German side, they could hear President Reagan giving this speech because they were just on the other side of the wall. And so really what had happened is the nation said, well, the United States is telling Russia, the Soviet Union, if you really want peace in your country and if you want your Soviet people to do well, tear down the wall, open up the Soviet Union and Berlin to capitalism. And finally, on November 9th, 1989, the gates opened. 10,000 East Germans tried to cross the wall since John F. Kennedy's presidency in 1961. But now, in November of 1989, people are flooding to the wall and destroying it. This video, which we watched in class, shows civilians of East Germany and West Germany going to the wall and tearing it down because the government earlier that day said, well, I guess the wall is going to eventually come down. It might as well start coming down now, which then led to both sides flooding to the wall and tearing it down. Now, the Soviet Union would eventually collapse in 1991, creating all of those different Eastern European countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, etc. And so finally in 1991, the Cold War ends. There is no more cold relationship, cold hostilities, threat of military fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what's kind of funny is that if you really want to see how communism failed in the Soviet Union and how capitalism from the United States won, watch this video in 1990, McDonald's opening in Russia. With Russia opening at McDonald's, it shows the United States' ideas and policies in capitalism have truly flourished. Now, we see that capitalism has made its way to Moscow, the Russian capital. The Cold War is now over. There is no more terse relationship between the Soviet Union and America. And we now see that the arms race is over. The threat of nuclear war is over. Containment and communism is not going to spread anywhere else. And the Cold War has come to a close with the coming down of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Start working on that paper.